Welcome everybody. My name is Anna Williams. I work for the North Wales Wildlife Trust as Education and Community Officer, covering North West Wales. And my colleague Iwan, who will be talking for the second half of this presentation, he works out of our North East office in Aberdeen. I don't know how much you know about the Trust, but you can see our website there, northwestwildlifetrust.org.uk. On it, you can find out about our nature reserves and all the activities we do. We manage 36 reserves around North Wales, and that is part of the work we do. We also have a Living Seas project. We have teenage work, and then the community and education work that Ewan and I do. And we run events, and you can find them all on the website. Now, of course, with COVID, some of our events have changed a bit, but we're still doing guided walks, and I'm doing one this week, which would be great. As a charity, you are very welcome to join us as a member. We are a membership organization, and all that information is available online, and I think we'll send out a link in the chat during this talk as well. You can, if you want to come out, you can come volunteering. And actually, interestingly, we've had more volunteers wanting to join us during the last few months than ever before, which is great to see. But unfortunately, because of COVID, sometimes we also have to limit numbers. But you're very welcome to contact us if you want to volunteer with us. We have quite different tasks that you can help with. So for all those, for more information about membership and volunteering, just go on our website or give us a call, and there'll be somebody there to talk to you about it. Have I forgotten anything? So no, I think that's most what I want to say about the Trust. So let's get going about hedges, trees and orchards. So, of course, we are going to look at it more from a wildlife point of view, and the best hedges for wildlife, they are thick and broadest at the bottom, with a range of woody species such as hawthorn, blackthorn, field maple, hazel, spindle, wayfaring tree. I'm going to talk about them in turn, and sometimes also with some ash and oak that can be left to grow as standards. And of course, in your hedge, you can have all sorts of other plants coming through, climbers. So a wildlife-friendly garden has a few. If you do want to be successful attracting wildlife, you really need, number one, is shelter. So if you've got a spot, what I would always start with is the hedges or the boundaries. So that's where they come in. Obviously, you need food for the wildlife, but the hedges can provide a lot of that. And then you need water. So in our work on a day-to-day basis, Ewan and I do advise about wildlife-friendly gardening, and hedges and trees are obviously quite a large part of that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the plants, and then Ewan will be coming in on the maintenance and showing examples of what he's been doing. So either you can buy your plants as bare root with a root ball, or potted plants. And I'll go through them in turn. You can see them there. So bare root, we call them whips, and those are known as the most efficient way really of ordering hedging. The plants have been grown in a field, and they're usually about 2 years old. 1+1 they call them in nursery term. And we plant them now in the dormant season from November onwards to March. So in a nursery you have to wait till the leaves fall, and then you can start pulling them up. So in the nursery they will pull them up, and within a couple of days you will have them delivered. And this is by far the cheapest option if you have any length of hedge to do. That is how a lot of the Woodland Trust plants are coming out from their schemes. So the root ball plants, they have been grown for a few more years in the field. So the rows are wider, the trees have had time to bush out a bit. You get a bigger plant, and it's actually quite a good idea if you want relatively quick establishment. Though they are, so in a private garden, I think it can be a very good choice. They are a bit expensive than bare roots, but I was checking a few prices today, and on many sites they weren't that much more expensive. So of course, when you order them, you don't need to be so worried about the roots having died in transport, because they come with a bit of soil around the ball. So think about the root ball option as well. Pot plants. When you buy pot plants, you get the freedom that you can plant them any time of year. Although, having said that, I wouldn't plant a hedge just before summer or on a really hot spring like last year. So it's definitely the autumn or winter is a good time to plant a hedge for any trees, I would say. They can grow a lot bigger, so you can buy them up to 6 foot, which, you know, it's very big, and that will be reflected in the price, more expensive. So for the native hedges, which is what I've mainly been planting, we are using a variety, as I mentioned, a species. I think hawthorn for me is a must. Some of the schools don't like prickles, but I think they are very good for a number of reasons. They have got their berries and they thicken up. And actually, as individual trees, I like hawthorn as well. They absolutely can be a stunner in any garden. So blackthorn is slightly more contentious because it shoots out suckers everywhere. So they can become a little bit of a pain. And they're also harder to manage with their thorns. So think about it before you add blackthorn, although I absolutely love them because they produce lovely sloes as well, of course. Hazel, hazel I think is an excellent hedge plant. Crabapple, you might get some local ones grown. We have a few people who are raising their trees locally, so do look around where you live and see if there are some people who just started nurseries. I think it's becoming increasingly popular, and I think that's a great thing. Elder, I will get back to that. Field maple, and of course introduce some things that you might not see very often, like spindle, guelder rose, and holly, as in the picture, of course, is good as an evergreen in any hedge. I'm mentioning dog rose and honeysuckle. They can rumble through the hedge, looking nice and providing good nectar. And then cornus, dogwood, can be a completely different type of hedge, but very attractive with the colourful branches and stems. Oak, I mentioned before, and we'll get back to oak later. I mean, they are great. They can be laid and they can also be left to grow tall as a standard. So we are not completely purists, obviously. There's a lot of very good plants for non-native hedges. Mentioning a few, there will be a lot more, and you can tell me about your own experiences afterwards. Berberis is the bottom left there, that comes in different colors, and they can establish very quickly in difficult sites and provide a good prickly boundary. I haven't talked much why we want a hedge, but I think that's fairly obvious. They were planted as a boundary to keep stock in, and now obviously around our gardens and just to delineate the edges of people's property. Pyracantha, top left, I absolutely love firethorn, as it's called as well, and that forms a really good climber if you grow them individually or on a wall, or you can grow it as a hedge. Very popular with the bees and then also with the birds, the berries. Escallonia, it's a colourful shrub which you can treat as a hedge and plant as a hedge, that's top right. And the fuchsia is very, very tolerant of salt, and that's why you see them a lot in Ireland and Devon. Forms a good hedge. We don't only need to think of hedges as big things. You can also, of course, have smaller hedges, lavender and dogwood that you can prune back, which provides great colour in winter. So there were a few ideas for species, and now I'm just going to go into a little bit more of the technicalities of when to plant and how to plant. So for your bare roots or root ball planting, it's best to start anytime now, and then you can carry on right through the winter. But it's important, you don't want to plant if the soil is waterlogged or obviously frozen. So you have to choose your timing depending on what's happening in the winter. The sort of evergreen or semi-evergreen hedges like box or privet, they can be planted through the winter, autumn, but they are actually best planted in early autumn, so they get a little time to establish. And yew hedges as well, the evergreen hedges. Right, site prep. As for any gardening or any work, it's important to give the trees a chance early on in their establishment phase. So don't just stick them into a very weedy area. Do your site prep, get rid of the weeds, and then maybe mark out your hedge with a string. It makes it a lot easier, especially when you have a lot of helpers. So if you've got a fence or a wall, maybe stick your hedge about 2 to 3 foot away from the edge. And I mean, it will grow into it, but it's worthwhile giving it space on both sides to grow. And when you do the double rowed hedges, which I think are by far the best, is best for wildlife, you get a little bit of width and depth, then tend to do the rows about 1 foot apart and the plants also 1 foot apart, but in staggered rows. So you get a zigzag pattern. And here you can see we mark them out. It's quite easy when you use a weed membrane, because then you make slits. And then we had this was at a school, and it's very easy and obvious to know where to plant. So you need about 5 to 6 trees per meter. You can, however, plant further apart if you have bigger plants, or if you have space. If you have a land, you might as well do a wide hedge. You can stick your plants 1.5 foot apart, and both the plants and the row spacing can be wide. I think depends on the age of the trees you're putting in, and then also the space that you have available on how close you plant. What I mentioned already is that we use a weed membrane. And again, I think people underestimate the need for this, or some kind of mulch anyway. Even if you have wood chip, you can put you need a thick layer, a good 6-inch layer. Because I've seen too many attempts to create hedges, and within a year, trees have completely disappeared under tall grasses, and people wonder why they're not working. But a little tree needs the sun, just as any other plant, and also need the moisture. So when you use a membrane or a mulch, you do actually really reduce the need for watering, because it stops evaporation. And that is something I probably haven't put a slide in, but certainly a newly planted hedge needs to be watered the first 2 years during the dry periods of the year. So do remember that you can't just stick the plants in and hope for the best. The successful planting, give it a little bit of TLC. And that was the hedge that you saw the children plant there 2 years later. It's well established. We are still putting on wood chip. And if you're having big projects, it's quite often I manage to get wood chip for free from a number of different arboriculturists. Just check them out in your local area, and quite often they're happy to give you wood chip because they need to get rid of it themselves. So you can, of course, plant in a single row if you haven't got the space, and you stick your whips about 1 foot apart, and so you need half the number of trees. Here I can see they're growing very close to the first fence. I think they were actually allowed to grow onto that fence, and there's a bigger fence to the side. So you, depending on the site, you will choose single or double row. And I am always surprised how quickly those little whips will take to establish, given the right conditions. Here it's another place just to show a single row being planted. These plants had slightly better developed root systems, which we were grateful for, but we couldn't just do the slit planting. And I did mention slit planting before. What you do then is simply to put your spade in, wriggle it about, so you loosen the soil, and then if you have a fairly small root system, well, a lot of the whips do have, or a little, even a small thin container they might have grown in, you can just stick them in at the back of the spade and then close the spade up and make sure that you stamp on the soil around it so that you close up the hole. And that's a very quick way of planting a hedge. And that's what you do on a bigger scale, planting of trees. In this particular instance, we had to do a slight compromise because the root ball was that much bigger. So we had to sort of make a slit, but dig around a bit. And then it's really important, I'm sure that's the obvious one, to tell that to fill up with soil so that the roots are not left in holes with just air in them. So plant like any other plant, and here you can see the result. That hedge has established well and can now be treated like a rectangular hedge, cut on top and sides. And of course they provide great places for birds to come and breed and also use as a songpost. I mentioned the time and care I think you should spend before planting, and then also think about after. What are the dangers? What might stop your hedge from being successful? Well, rabbits is an obvious one, sheep, but also the weeds I mentioned, and then brush cutters, strimmers. That's so common that people ring bark them by being a little bit too keen on cutting the grass around the trees or near to the hedge. So make sure that you do the protective measures. Here I got the plants actually from the national park, and the boys are putting in the tree guards around each tree. We did 30 meters in about a day, including putting down the weed membrane, and it's great to get everybody out to help. So as a community project, hedges work very well. And of course, I mentioned wildlife. They are so important. They will provide shelter and nesting opportunities for birds, woodland and farmland birds such as yellowhammer, whitethroat, blue-tit, grey-tit, and then the nectar. And of course, later on, berries and nuts, which is very important food for mammals. And amphibians and reptiles will also have a hiding and sheltering place under hedges. So I like it here, how you manage it, and we'll get into that later, but it will obviously depend on what your aim of the hedge is. You might have to keep it neat, but even a hedge that's been closely cropped, like this one on the bottom left, had a number of blackbirds nesting in it. So even whether you cut it, but you have to make sure that you don't cut it during bird breeding season, so they need to be cut in autumn, then they should be good for the next year. Well, Ewan will talk about cutting later. Hedges are not only important around your boundary, but they can provide really nice areas inside a garden and within a garden, so to create different rooms in your garden. And on this photo, I'm in a garden in the Conwy Valley, Rowan, and it was absolutely full of birds. We used to run a wildlife garden competition, and this man who owned the garden is a very keen birder and certainly knew how to create the habitats to attract the birds. So plenty of shelter and plenty of wildlife. I don't think I mentioned butterflies, but butterflies also appreciate hedges, and there's the hedge brown that will lays eggs on hedge plants. So I haven't mentioned bats, yes, but hedges are incredibly important for bats. They're a linear feature in the landscape. And the hedges actually, I'll see if I can play this with. I hope you can see that. The bat is feeding along a hedge, and this is the hedge at the top of my garden, which is a mixture of hawthorn, blackthorn and elder. And this was I filmed this on the last day of October, Halloween, and I was quite impressed with this bat. There was actually two of them coming very close to me, but feeding for a very long time along this hedge. So even though we can't see the insects, they are there, and the bats will navigate along the hedges. Oops, sorry, I'm going to go to the next slide. So there's some sad statistics. Since the Second World War, we lost 16,000 kilometers of hedges. That's been mainly due to intensive farming and the need to increase the area that you're producing food on. But I think that was slightly misguided, and today in many environmental schemes, people are encouraged to plant hedges in the uplands again. Of course, the hedges are important to keep rainwater, slow rainwater coming off the hills, and also from an erosion point of view. Because even in certainly in mid Wales, in our Welsh hills, we get erosion, and hedges will help to stop this. So I'm very keen that hedges is always part of any environmental scheme on farms and in the uplands. With the loss of the hedges, we've lost these habitats for these hedgehogs, birds, etc. Hedges and boundaries obviously can look slightly different, and I'm just going to show some examples. This is a hedge on the bottom right corner, which we planted with just some willow whips. We'd done a willow dome, and I had this left over, and they needed some kind of fence. And now, years later, I was back there actually yesterday, and that is treated like a normal hedge now. We just use hedge cutters top and bottom, and it's got a fairly rectangular shape. Very cheap and alternative way to create a hedge. Just to throw in a few stone walls. I know they're not hedges, but they are great boundaries as well, because of course they provide hidey holes for robins, red stars, wrens, slow worms, voles, and all sorts of animals will live in your stone walls, including hibernating insects like ladybirds. We used to go and find them in our stone walls when I first moved to Wales. Right, on to trees. I mentioned the oak, which is such a great tree for wildlife. It supports more life than any other tree in Britain. So if you have space, do grow some oaks. And now is a great time to plant your acorns. I planted some myself the other day, and if you find them locally, of course, you get local provenance, and that's a great way to increase our local woodland area. So get yourselves, children, friends planting, and let's get them planted out there in the community and in our gardens. The rowan provides lovely red berries for the birds and autumn colour as well. Silver birch has good seeds for finches, I particularly like them. Bircherry, again, food for the birds and good nectar source, as well as willow. Willow, maybe surprisingly, is a very good early nectar for bumblebees. So willow is an important tree, and they are so easy to grow from cuttings. I mentioned hazel, and as kids, it was something we always did. Went around and we knew exactly where the hazels grew because we went and collected the nuts. And I must say, I was quite disappointed talking to many children in schools. They haven't got a clue about hazel nuts and that you can eat them and that you can go and collect them. It's just small little things like that that, you know, it's valuable knowledge for a forager, and also it's how you know your local community. So yeah, do pass on the knowledge of these things to the younger generation. We're getting onto fruit trees in a minute. So reiterating some good plants: rowan, hawthorn, blackthorn and elder, both for the bees and the birds, but also for people. Of course, we benefit from what we grow. Crabapple jelly is absolutely delicious and so easy to make, as well as elderflower cordial. I make it every year and it's very popular, both as a gift and within the family. Orchards. Iwan and I have been involved with a number of different orchard projects. So I think we must have planted in more than 30 schools by now in the whole of North Wales. And I was very pleased to be able to go out the other day to plant some more trees this autumn. I've got about 30 waiting to go out when COVID came. And here we are planting in Pennygroes, and the pupils do all the work. I just told them what to do, and that worked really well. We're going out next week again. So if you're doing one little project with a local school, I think planting apple trees is a great one, and you soon see why as well. The variety you choose will depend a lot on the conditions where you live. You know, is it exposed? Is it warm? Is it sheltered? So you have to do a little bit of research. I will tell you a few varieties that I've been planting in my schools. There's a huge number to choose from, and I would suggest you use a very good supplier like Frank Matthews, who you saw on the label in the previous shot. They have very good trees, and they have also very good information for you on their website about each tree. So the top here from Fiesta, Spartan, the Pippin, James Grieve, Blackstone Superb, Red Windsor, Scrumptious and Lord Lambourne and Sunset. Those are all eaters, and I've planted them in different schools with good results. You've got some trees that are called dual purpose, and I think they're always worth having in garden. And of course, the cookers. There's a huge number of cookers. I ran out of space and I literally just put on the Bramley type, but we can talk more about them later. Of course, you've probably heard about the Welsh varieties that Sturrrock and Sons are producing, like the Bardsey apple tree, which is one of the world's most rare apple trees. There was one tree on Bardsey Island that Sturrrock came across, and he grafted that and has since raised many hundreds. And the Bardsey apple tree you'd think would be very wind tolerant, but actually it's not. Where it grew was inside the wall of the monastery. But it's an interesting tree and it's worth a shot at planting one. And we got a whole array of them, and Iwan can probably talk more about them. He's been working on grafting a few other Welsh varieties. So again, you can get your trees, mostly you buy them in pots, but you can get them bare root from wholesalers, and that is a lot cheaper, but of course you need somewhere to be able to store them or heel them in. These ones here I had heeled in my own garden, and then I could just dig them up in the morning that we are planting. But that is a bit more maybe complicated. So most apple trees will be sold in pots, and here it doesn't matter, it happens to be a school, but wherever you are, you need to do the prep the same. I was very glad, this is up in Rosgadwan, the Headmaster actually came out, and that's exactly what we want to see, to get the teachers involved and see the value of the work that we do outside. So dig a hole, obviously as deep as your pot and a bit bigger. If your soil isn't very good, we tend to add a bit of compost or a dollop of well-rotted manure. But if you have very good soil, I don't see the need for this. There's different people have different opinions. But if you're going to add your manure or your compost, use peat-free compost or homemade if you got that. Fill up carefully, hold your trees upright, and maybe add some bulbs if you can. Very important addition to these orchards in schools or any public spaces are these wooden boxes or any type of protection around the base of the tree. Because as I mentioned before, so many trees have been lost to brush cutters, and it's such a waste of money and effort. So here you can see the girls actually making the boxes. This is what I usually do on the days or evenings before going out to plant an orchard. The boys putting in a rabbit protection, and then also we put a stake in, which we will tie to the tree. Here you can see a finished orchard. The trees should be, I don't know what you will say, but I think about 5 meters apart, depending on this rootstock you've had. So I haven't mentioned rootstock, but the trees come on different rootstock, and the rootstock will determine how big the tree grows to. So you can have dwarf rootstock, you can have medium, and then you can have standard, or they call it semi-dwarf and standard. And I'm not going into all the detail, but that is something you can easily find out when you buy your tree. So you're not only choosing for variety, but you also choose for rootstock, which will determine the final size of your tree. But give them space to grow. Here's the bottom of the clean, and an orchard is such a good place for learning. You can learn, you can have a little business, growing, selling, making things, and you can then also learn about where food comes from, imported apples. Why are we still buying apples from New Zealand or South Africa when we can grow so many lovely varieties in our own country? It's really a crime that we cut down the orchards in Britain and are now importing fruit. So wherever you can, buy local fruits in your shops and also encourage people to grow their own local food. There's a huge amount of wealth of information about all these different varieties and the folklore around them. And there's a lot to learn, and I really think it's important that we pass this knowledge on. And of course, it's become quite popular to have an apple day in the autumn. And here we're making apple juice at Conwy Food Festival. And the children here are very happy with the juice. So it's going, oh my goodness, it tastes just like real apples. I don't know, it does taste very different from the bought juice. And often a little bit more earthy. And of course for us, we can make cider as well. I haven't done that with schools yet. And then cooking, just cook apples with the kids, baked apples. Keep it simple and get them involved. There's no reason why we couldn't plant apples in more apple trees or any other fruit trees in public spaces. This is along Las Menai, and I just think, wow, that's such a obvious place to plant fruit trees. And then the public, anybody could come and help themselves. So I think that's a sort of way to go for our community and amenity grasslands. And here you can see we planted the Welsh varieties. Another place, of course, in a care home. This is in Llanberis, where I was asked to come and plant an orchard. It was a lovely day. We got the students from the local secondary school involved with actual planting. We had to do absolutely bomb-proof protection because the sheep roam free in Llanberis. So I hope they have survived. I haven't checked them out, but I think they've been looked after. And it was a local man who had the idea that it would be great for the people in their rooms at the care home to be able to look out over an orchard with the great flowers in the spring and summer. And then for the staff to be able to cook crumbles and pies with their own apples. I'm just going to finish off with a log pile photo because, of course, from trees will die, and a lot of the time we cut up all the wood for firewood or woodwork if you're that minded. But just mentioning, do leave a few in your gardens as log piles because they're excellent habitats for just about every part of our ecosystem. the decomposers, but also you'll get mammals in there, you'll get birds feeding, and you get plants growing through them. So overall, what I mentioned is the animals, but of course in the hedges you also have lovely herbaceous vegetation, things like cow parsley, hedge mustard, and the coarse grasses. And you will, along a woodland, along a hedge, you get like what's really known as a woodland edge flora. And that is one of the most valuable habitats that we can create. So it's a very varied habitat, and with a lot of life in it. So on that note, I'm going to finish. I just quite like this pruning ladder that's a local man has made, and I saw it when I was in a pruning course. So I think for a lot of you, there will hopefully be courses locally about pruning apple trees as well. Otherwise, let's ask Ewan to carry on with that. Okay, that's enough from me. Bye, and I'll stop sharing my screen and Ewan can share his.
Thank you, Anna. Sorry, I'm just a little bit out of wind. I just had to run to the house because my son is crying outside. So the joys of working from home. So excuse me, I'm a little bit out of breath.
Okay, I can talk for another minute. You catch your breath.
I'll try. It's quite good. I was trying to listen to your talk. There were loads of questions coming in as well. So I've been busy answering some of the questions that people have been asking, but maybe you can have a
okay
while I'm getting set up.
I will look at the questions. I mean, usually it's either a dog or a young child coming in interrupting. Let's see. Can I recommend a plastic-free membrane and possible supplier, please? Plastic-free membrane. Well, the only thing I could think of off the top of my head is cardboard, because you could use, but you maybe need a lot of cardboard. Because that's what I use sometimes in my veg garden, as a, you know, over winter to just keep the weeds down. And a supplier. I have to look into that. So if we can't answer the questions now, just email myself or Ewan. So that was anna.williams@northwaleswildlifetrust.org.uk, and we will do a little bit of research. Okay, so yeah, I will look up the research. So the weed membrane I use, I suppose it's a composite material. But I did look at it the other day, wondering if one could have something that is compostable completely. So we look into that. Let's see what other questions. How do you do grafting? Well, Ewan will talk about grafting. Oh yeah, somebody else mentioned cardboard. Yeah, that's what I would use. Would you recommend using bone meal? Yes, I didn't mention it, but I do certainly use bone meal if I have it, and I just have a handful of bone meal and we put it in at the bottom of the hole. But I haven't done research on it, so I honestly don't know how good it is, but I do think it depends on the site. If the soil is good anyway, I don't think you really need it, although it will help with root establishment. What else? Are you ready, Ewan?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay, so I'll let you go on and I will have a look through some of the questions. And then
please keep...
And we're very welcome for you, if you have experience of something that has worked well or hasn't worked, to add that onto the chat, because it's not just about us preaching to you. So do take part as well. Okay, bye. I'll let you have a go now.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, so my name's Iwan Edwards. I work from the East Office in Aberdeen, just outside Maeshaven, which is next to Mold. And I'm also a community and education officer like Anna. So between the two of us, we cover the whole of North Wales. And so yes, I'm going to talk about aftercare. Gofal ar ôl plannu eich coed. Sut I edrych ar ôl eich planhigion, ar ôl chi blannu nhw, how to look after your plants after you've planted them. So now that we've planted our wonderful young hedgerows, trees and orchards, it's time to take a look at aftercare so we can get the best out of them. We tend to plant trees and hedgerows for lots of different reasons. A plant's grown for its beauty in a garden setting. It often has a totally different function in a more kind of semi-natural habitat like an orchard or small copse of trees, where maybe productivity or shelter from the wind is the main reason why you've planted a tree or a hedge. Increasingly, however, as our gardens become more and more important for wildlife and more people garden with wildlife in mind, the lines between the two, the garden and the more semi-natural habitat, becomes increasingly blurred, and this is no bad thing. So I'll be referring to both those habitats, the garden and the kind of semi-natural habitats, over the next half an hour or so, and we're also going to look at examples of both young and mature trees and hedgerows.
Iwan, can I just
Certainly.
could you, because we can see your whole screen with the notes as well. Do you want to just do the slideshow?
Oh, right, okay. How's that?
Yeah, that's better. Thanks.
Okay. So yeah, let's get started. I'm not going to be able to cover everything, particularly when it comes to orchards. You could spend an hour and a half just talking about orchards. So I will mention orchards, but please, feel free to provide some questions, which we'll do our best to answer at the end of the talk. And we may even look at doing a presentation at some point in the near future, looking more specifically at certain elements of this talk. If you'd like to hear more information about a particular part of the talk that both Anna and I have given, then let us know. So once your trees have been planted, the aftercare should focus on watering, weeding, pest control, and also to make sure that your trees and hedges are healed in well, they're firmed in. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. So keep an area around the base of your tree or your hedgerow clear of weeds. About 1 meter square should do it. You can achieve this by using organic mulches, mulch mats like you can see in the picture here, or the other option is to hand weed them. Obviously is a little bit more laborious, or as a last resort, and this is often something used in a more commercial setting, particularly with orchards, is the use of herbicides to keep the area around the base of the tree clear. But I wouldn't be recommending that at all. The regular strimming and grass cutting around the base of the trees is not as effective as some of those elements of weed control, because basically by cutting the grass, it does nothing but stimulate the grass to grow better and effectively encourages competition for nutrients, competition for water. So it's much better to keep the area around the base of your tree clear of grass. I've been amazed here at home in my own orchard, when I was becoming increasingly frustrated at how slow the trees were developing. I planted them about 7 or 8 years ago, but about 2 years ago I decided I was going to spend a good couple of days clearing the grass, lifting the turf and the weeds around the base of each of the tree, and spending a good amount of time and money mulching the trees with manure and bark chip. And I've been absolutely amazed at the way that the trees have reacted to that. They've put on so much growth, And I can only put that down to the fact that the trees aren't having to compete with the grass and the weeds anymore, because grass steals the oxygen from the root zone, and particularly with young trees, as they're trying to get established, you know, they need nutrients, water, and lots of oxygen around their roots to grow healthily. So I can't stress enough how important mulching is. You'll also notice in the picture in the churchyard there, which is a lovely little churchyard in Mould, where we planted some crabapple trees. We've started putting boxes around the base of our trees, and I saw a few of the pictures that Anna was showing in her part of the presentation. Really effective for stopping the grass from growing around the base of your tree, and stops the need for cutting or the strimmer going anywhere near the base of your tree, because it doesn't matter how good you think you are with your strimmer, you know, it just takes a little nick of that bark to replicate the damage that rabbits would do. You can see in this picture here that this tree has also got a rabbit guard around the base of the tree. So boxes filled with mulch can be really, really effective, particularly in the kind of community setting or in a school setting where contractors will be cutting the grass around the base of trees. Rabbits, hares, voles, sheep, cows, horses, they all cause a lot of damage to our trees, especially young trees. Squirrels too, of course. And protective guards are particularly important. And if you've got livestock, then adequate fencing around each of your trees as well. Obviously, grazing is a big part of orchard habitat maintenance, but I wouldn't let the sheep near the trees until they're a good, decent size, and that the sheep are kept in there not too long, because if they run out of food in terms of grass, they'll start turning their attentions to the bark of the trees. Doesn't matter what age they are, and you can see the picture on the right-hand side there, the type of damage that can happen overnight with sheep in an orchard. So for the first few months after planting, particularly after strong winds or after winter, when you've had a lot of frost, it's important to make sure that you heel in your plants. Keep firming the soil around the base of the trees, because what you get in the winter time is as the soil freezes, it kind of heaves the plant out of the hole that you've put it in. It's actually called frost heave. So what you want to do is go around and push the soil back in around each tree. This makes sure that you've got your roots of your trees are in good contact with the soil, and prevents air pockets forming around the roots. And this again is really, really important, because if you've got air pockets in the soil around your roots, they can't make that jump through that gap to the soil. So your trees will really struggle, and quite often they will die. So it's really important to make sure that your soil is healed in around the base of your tree or your hedge. And also, really important to think about tree ties, stakes. The number of times I've seen trees which have been planted really well, but someone's forgotten to remove the stake after a certain number of years, or they have forgotten to open the tree tie. So the tree will grow around the tree tie, it'll basically strangle it, and it can be enough to kill the tree. Also, the positioning of the stake, make sure that the stake is on the side of the tree which receives the wind mostly. So on the southwest side, generally in North Wales. Place your stake on the southwest side, because it will blow the tree away from your tree stake. If you put it on the other side, the tree will slowly knock against the tree stake, and if it does that 100 times a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, that is going to cause a lot of damage to your tree. And of course, if the bark is broken, that's when pathogens and infection gets into your tree. It's got past that first line of defense. So Mulching, incredibly important, as I've said. You can use manure, you can use cardboard with maybe 4 or 5 inches of organic material over the top of it. Compost, if you're emptying your compost heap after the winter time or before the winter time. Wood chips, bark chips, any organic matter that's going to rot down will generally do very well. Grass clippings even, although I wouldn't put too much of it on at any one time. One thing I found particularly effective as a mulch is sheep's wool. So if you've got a local farmer and at the end of the season, if there's a little bit of wool lying around, that makes a really, really good mulch for your trees. Traps the moisture in, reduces evaporation, reduces weed competition, increases the humus richness of your soil, so your trees are doing much happier. I can't recommend highly enough mulching as a way of ensuring the best from your trees and hedges. You may also want to add wood ash or lime, depending on the type of soil that you have. Increasing the fertility of your soil. There's been mention of bone meal in the questions earlier on. Bone meal is particularly good, especially for feeding the roots of our trees, and also attracts earthworms to the area. So the earthworms then aerate the soil underneath our trees. And you can, if you haven't got tons and tons of manure at hand, you can put some pelleted fertilizer, organic fertilizer like chicken manure or 6X or something similar, which is very potent, very strong. So you don't need much of it. So again, a big tub of that will go a long, long way. And also, just as whilst we're looking at this picture, tree guards, lots of different tree guards available. Some biodegradable, some not. But again, lots of, a major factor in the success, particularly of young trees. So wind protection also makes a huge difference to the success of our hedgerows and trees. I would almost say that I've seen hedgerows grow twice as fast with a bit of wind protection. Obviously it depends on site and location, but if you can protect trees, particularly evergreen trees, or holly in your hedge, you can protect it from the wind. They will grow much, much quicker. The thing with evergreens, if you are planting things like holly in your hedge, even though in the wintertime the roots go to sleep, the leaves are still evapotranspirating, they're still losing moisture. So by reducing the amount of wind going past the leaves of evergreens, you're reducing the chances of loss. So yeah, it's important to think about wind protection. Particularly, there was a question in the earlier on about transplanting holly. You can transplant it at this time of year. Early autumn is probably the best time to be transplanting evergreens whilst the soil is still warm. But do make sure that there's adequate wind protection, because those roots won't be replenishing the water that's being lost from leaves. You could possibly create a hazel hurdle to provide wind protection. We've done a lot of hazel hurdle particularly with the Living Churchyard project, which we were running a few years ago. We still work with a lot of churchyards, increasing biodiversity and managing churchyards for wildlife. So this group of volunteers here making a hazel hurdle to protect the hedge that's being planted behind, but also to create a composting area. Obviously with hazel, you're going to need a lot of material. You might have access to hazel coppice. So this is one good way of managing your trees and, lots of different species, in fact. So as well as the kind of ornamental benefit, coppicing is it's a very practical solution for managing large established trees, especially if you've got a small garden. So what coppicing does is it exploits the natural growth of a tree. If the main stem has been cut or it's fallen, it'll naturally send up shoots, new shoots, in a bid to survive. So if the root system has been used to feed a large tree, it will put all its energy into all this young growth, and you get a rush of lots of young growth coming from where your old tree was. So you've probably heard of coppicing, plisgoidio in Gymraeg. It was once an essential part of managing woodlands. Coppice trees were a huge part of the economy, providing fuel, building and fencing materials, and today, you know, a lot of people, including the Wildlife Trust, are bringing back coppicing because of the major benefits to biodiversity. Cutting back trees opens up woodlands, it allows light in, and encourages a wider range of plants and wildlife. So you can coppice a lot of different species. In the past, sweet chestnut and hornbeam were probably the most commonly, and hazel were the most commonly grown trees and shrubs for coppicing. But as I say, most trees will respond positively to a brutal chop. As long as the tree is well established and hasn't been grafted, it should survive a brutal chop. The size and style of our gardens usually restricts the choice of larger trees, but you know, even in small gardens, you can plant trees that could potentially become larger trees as long as you keep on top of the pruning. Obviously, you have to think about the people who are going to move into your house after you've moved out, but it shouldn't mean that you are not able to choose those particular species for your garden. So, as with all gardens, if left unattended, things very, very soon get out of hand, and in a more semi-natural habitat like a traditional orchard or a copse of trees, they can become dense scrub, tangled thickets without the intervention that's needed. If, for example, you move into a property and you inherit an orchard with that new house and garden, you should think carefully before going in there with your chainsaw or your pruning equipment and making big changes. Always best to sit back and see through a whole season, through a whole year, what your garden does, or what your orchard does, or what your hedgerow does. So the first steps would be an assessment of what's already growing there. And that assessment should include the trees, the shrubs, the boundaries, the marginal areas, the soil, the herb layer, and any other features that you've got in your garden. This is a picture of an old orchard in the Vale of Clwyd. Has seen better days, but as it is in that picture, a fantastic habitat for wildlife. As you can see, lots of dead standing wood where the trees have died on the right hand side. On the left hand side, overbearing trees, dense canopy, small fruit, all of that fruit falling onto the ground, providing food for wildlife. And in the middle of in the back of the picture, a pear tree covered in ivy. So, although not necessarily a fantastically healthy orchard in terms of human perspective, but for wildlife, you know, a wonderful habitat. So, when you're considering the condition of individual trees, whether it's fruit trees or any other trees in your garden, it's important that the variety and the heritage value of that tree is identified. So when we were running the orchard recovery project, you know, we were visiting lots of old orchards, and the first thing to do is assess what you've got there already, have a look at the trees, identify the varieties of fruit trees you've got in there, because for all you know, you may have some really rare North Wales varieties. So you should focus on the health and the vitality of your orchard. If the trees are particularly old and severely compromised, like this one is in an orchard near Abergele, possibly beyond restoration, you should then think about grafting and budding material onto a suitable rootstock. So if you're going to, there's not enough time to explain how to graft during this presentation, but we will be running a course in the Woodland Skills Centre in Bodfari in probably March 2021, where we'll be talking about how to manage your orchard, how to prune, and how to graft as well. But if you have got your eye on a particular apple tree or fruit tree that you want to take cuttings from, anytime between now and spring is a good time to take those cuttings. Get nice young fleshy shoots, and you know, about pencil thickness, about 6 inches to 8 inches long. Wrap them up in a wet tissue and stick them in the fridge, and then you're ready to graft them onto a rootstock in the spring. So yeah, Anna mentioned the idea of different types of rootstock for your fruit trees. Again, far too much information to go into here. So that process of rejuvenating a tree kind of, you know, perpetuates the survival of the existing orchard stock, and once you've firmly established the next generation, like you can see, we've got a young whip of a tree in this picture, right next to an old tree, which is well, certainly seen better days. And you can let those old trees then decline naturally and become a wonderful wildlife habitat. Don't be tempted to pull them down and get rid of them. Leave them as standing deadwood, because as Anna mentioned in her talk, there's no better habitat in your garden than a pile of dead logs, particularly if it's standing deadwood. So really ecologically important component of any well, garden or semi-natural habitat. So other intentions in terms of management should be thinking about this kind of sympathetic management of pests and diseases. If you can go organic, then you're feeding into the whole kind of concept that your garden is a functional, dynamic, you know, and it has its own little ecosystem. And if you go in there with herbicides and pesticides, you're disrupting that natural cycle, nature's ability to look after itself. So organic methods of management, and pruning, which we will talk about in a second. In terms of your hedgerow, once your hedgerow is well established, you can think about a little buffer strip along the edge of your hedgerow. There's lots of research out there showing that some long grass next to a hedgerow is an absolutely fantastic habitat. So if you have a setting like you can see in this picture, you know, a rural setting like a field, you know, you can put your fence about 1 to 3 meters away from the hedge, and you know, I've got the same in my garden here, where there's one part of the garden where we never cut the grass, or we cut the grass maybe once every 3 years, up to the base of the hedgerow. But the rest of the time, you'll see the birds flying in and out of there all of the time. So a buffer strip next to your hedgerow is a fantastic thing to have. Different hedge sizes, types, features, value to different species. So the best hedge for wildlife has varied character along its length. It will attract a wide range of wildlife. Short hedges with wide grass buffer strips are preferred by birds like grey partridges, linnets and yellowhammers. Lapwings and corn buntings prefer open fields with short hedges or hedgeless banks. Tall and wide hedges suit birds like turtle doves, bullfinches and song thrushes. And a good shrub layer and a growth at the base of your hedgerow is a great benefit to lots of species, including hedgehogs, amphibians, reptiles. So we're just going to talk a little bit about pruning, pruning your fruit trees, your trees and your hedgerows. So in its simplest form, pruning involves removing segments of a tree, a shrub or a hedgerow by physical means for a specific function. So pruning is used to improve the shape and character of a tree, promoting the health of a tree, removing unwanted growth, removing dead wood, particularly from an old derelict fruit tree like you can see in this picture here. And if done correctly, although pruning fruit trees is a bit of an art form, if done correctly, it can really improve the health and vigour of your trees. So, very simply, pruning should focus on the removal of dead, diseased, and crossing branches. So, looking at this tree in the picture here, you'd have your work cut out. But you'd start off by removing dead, damaged, diseased, and any branches which are crossing and rubbing against each other, causing lesions in the bark. You want to reduce the overcrowding. You want to improve the symmetry and the balance of the tree. And over a period of time, maybe not straight away, over maybe 2 or 3 years, you can redefine the shape and stature of your fruit trees. Lots of different techniques are adopted with pruning fruit trees. There's tip-bearing fruit trees, spur-bearing fruit trees. There's summer pruning, there's winter pruning. Again, it gets very, very confusing very, very quickly. But essentially, if you've never done any fruit tree pruning or tree pruning in the past, then if you start with the removal of dead, diseased, damaged, then it's a good start. Just think of the 3 Ds: dead, diseased, and damaged. And then you can move on to winter and summer pruning at a later date. So what happens if you don't prune, particularly fruit trees? Well, they become cluttered. They produce lots and lots of fruit, but of smaller and lower quality, like this one in a walled garden in Ruthin, which we helped to restore as part of our orchard recovery project. And again, whilst this is a fantastic habitat for wildlife, it's not the most productive tree for humans. So again, there's that decision to make about why you're growing trees or fruit trees in the first place. So a little bit about formative pruning. If you've planted a young tree, while many trees naturally form their adult shape as they grow, others, particularly fruit trees, need a bit of assistance to create a good balanced structure. So it's a good idea to keep an eye on young trees and do a little bit of formative pruning, particularly in those first 2, 3, 4 years. And you will save a lot of work in the long run by getting that nice framework of branches set up from the word go. So the idea is to create an open, balanced network of strong branches that will support a heavy fruit crop. There are different pruning techniques depending on what you want to achieve. Commercial orchards will often prune in a very different way to what you would do in a garden setting. Generally, in a garden setting, you want to create a kind of goblet-shaped tree where there's lots of light and lots of air circulating in the middle of the tree. The old saying goes that you should be able to throw your hat through the middle of the tree after you've finished pruning it. So there's lots of different ways of pruning trees and shrubs, but the general principles and the tools to be used are basically the same. So saws are employed by the removal of larger limbs, long-handled pruners, heavy-duty or ratchet secateurs are very good. You may need to reach for the chainsaw with the larger trees, or it may be a professional job for an arboriculturalist. Other tools which are particularly handy, particularly to get good, clean, tidy cuts, is a pruning knife, and then of course you might need a ladder to get into the tree in the first place. So as you can see in the picture on the right hand side there, some decent pruning cuts which have started to heal over. Your pruning cut needs to be clean, and so your tools need to be very, very sharp, and also they need to be clean. So you can clean your tools with special stuff that you buy in a shop, or you can just use methylated spirits, which is what I tend to do. But it's particularly important if you're moving from one tree to another, and particularly for us working at the Wildlife Trust, if we're going from one site to another site, then we need to be particularly sure that we're not carrying diseases and pathogens from one site to another. There's lots of really great YouTube clips online about how to prune trees and how to do it really effectively. The PTES, the People's Trust for Endangered Species, have a fantastic video on different aspects of fruit tree pruning, and I'd probably recommend those above any others that I've seen. Horizontal pruning cuts should be avoided. Cuts should be sloping. They should be clean. And the reason we cut them at an angle is for the water to run off it and stops the cut end of the branch from rotting. You see in this picture here is someone has taken a chainsaw at some point to this tree. Obviously gotten to become too big. They've chopped the end of the branch, and what's happened the following spring is all of the sap, as it's rising, there's nowhere to go because there's a dead end there, and so you get all of these dormant buds or branches or along that main trunk or water shoots bursting from the main stem, and you get lots of these really useless branches growing far too close to each other, and that's just the tree dealing with the excess of sap that's being produced because you've chopped off a really large limb. There are ways to get around that. Again, I don't want to get into the technicalities of pruning too much here because it'll take up too much time. One important thing to add is if you are pruning your cherries and plums and your stone fruits, that is better done in the summertime, because if you prune your damsons and plums and cherries in the winter, there's a greater chance of infection, particularly by things like silverleaf. So it's better to cut them in the summertime when the wound can bleed, and that pushes out any pathogens or pests trying to get into the cut end of the into the wound. You do tend to prune stone fruit in a different way to pears and apples. Apart from the fact that apples and pears are mainly pruned in the wintertime, you can prune them in summer as well. Stone fruit only done in the summertime, and you may find that you've got years when there's heavy cropping, which cause some of the branches to break. So prune back any of those broken branches, prune back any undamaged wood, maybe thin your trees out to 5 or 6 main stems, rather than have too much branch network. But generally, stone fruit don't like to be pruned as much as apples and pears. So trees grown on fertile soils in a good location, well managed, looked after. Apple trees can live over 150 years. Pear trees can live in excess of 300 years. What you see in this picture here is a typical growth habit of a pear tree. They tend to want to grow straight up to the sky. So you've got to work hard to get a good shape on your pear trees. Just one little mention of ivy. Obviously, ivy is a wonderful plant, probably one of the most useful wildlife plants because it produces nectar at this time of year, before they then produce berries, which feed our birds through the winter time. Thickets provide the home for nesting birds, for bats. It is a wonderful plant, but obviously there are issues with ivy growing up trees. Lots of people ask the question, should I get rid of ivy on my tree? And my kind of stock answer would be, if it's a tree that could potentially cause damage next to a house, next to a path, next to a road, and there's a lot of ivy growing on it, then there is an argument for cutting that ivy down because it adds to the weight of the canopy of the tree. But in any other setting, I would encourage ivy growing up trees. They don't kill trees, but what they do is they hasten the demise of a tree. So if you have a tree that's old and starting to lose its limbs, becoming weak, then the added weight of ivy in the canopy can be enough to be the end of that tree. But as I say, it's a wonderful, wonderful plant and a wonderful habitat, particularly for the little tawny owl that you see sitting in this particular little tree. So I will probably try and finish there because we're getting on a bit. I think we're due to finish at 5:30. So I'll stop there. I'll stop sharing if I can try and do that. And then I'll bring Anna back in. And see if there are any questions.
Iwan?
Yeah.
They're asking, Tracy's asking about the young man, the tree surgeon. Was that Simon? No, with a hat, with a cap.
Yes, it was.
It was Simon.
Simon Farr.
Simon Farr. I don't know if it's your nephew, Tracy. Oh no, you can see now that it isn't him. Okay, just for interest. It was Simon Farr. He used to run a orchard project in North East Wales.
Yeah, fantastic. Fantastic job.
Yes, and some other questions. Hopefully the recording is working and it shall be on our YouTube channel. So if you go on YouTube, North Wales Wildlife Trust, you shall find it. We have some other ones there already. Ewan and I talked about meadows and wildlife gardening, and there's plenty others that our colleagues have done. Right, any other questions? Let's have a look. So, yeah, we hope you got some ideas out of it. If you have any more questions, keep on typing now. Yeah, local suppliers, you did answer that, Pottles plants. But also, nearly every year the Woodland Trust have a grant schemes on free trees for hedges, or you can also pay for a slightly larger pack. I don't know if they're doing it this year. Have you checked up on that, Ewan? They probably are.
Sorry, what was that, Anna? I was reading
The wooden trust and the trees, do they, I mean, it will be too late for obviously for this year, but usually you apply the previous spring for the following autumn, don't you?
Yeah, I think you have to be a part of a community group or
Okay. Yeah.
to apply for those trees. But yeah, the Woodland Trust, there's a few others as well that provide free packs of trees if you can get them.
And then it's also just word of mouth, because I just found out from somebody locally that there was a guy, a one-man band in the Gwynedd Valley who started a tree nursery. I had no idea.
Right.
But we bought whips from him for the garden up here, in really good condition. So it's really nice because he collected local seeds. Oh, and of course, Ewan has got a tree nursery at Aberdeen, haven't you?
Yes. So we've just set up a tree nursery at our HQ in Aberdeen. So we're looking actually for local provenance seed, rare trees, but also some common species as well. I think the main thing is that it's mature trees. So they are local provenance rather than trees that have been planted at any time over the last kind of 50 to 70 years maybe. So yeah, anyone out there who's into collecting seed, then we'd be very interested, because the plan is to train up a group of wonderful volunteers who are going to propagate and take cuttings and grow seed on. So we have our own stock of local provenance trees, which is which is an issue moving forward. We do need lots more organically grown local provenance trees and hedgerow plants as well. So yeah, keep an eye out for our tree nursery in Aberdeen.
And we actually in the West, we are hoping to also start a tree nursery over the following year. But as with all these projects, they need staff, obviously, so or volunteers. So again, if you live in the West and you would be keen to help us with a tree nursery, possibly one at Gwaith Powder down near Penrhyn Deidrath, and then one on Anglesey at Corsgore. So I said, when I retire, I could look after a nursery, but at the minute, I'm too busy.
Okay, so there's a question here from Ruth Richards. What part of the apple tree is used to identify the variety? And can you recommend a website where all the varieties of Welsh apples are shown? So that website would be Ian Sturrrock and Sons. They've got a huge range of different Welsh heritage fruit trees. And so I think if you place your order now, hopefully you'll have a decent amount of stock this year. If you come across a tree and you want to identify it, you can go along to, well, in a COVID-free world, you could go along to some of the events put on in North Wales, where specialists may be able to identify the variety just by looking at the fruit. But what I tend to do is send apples and leaves. So you need a couple of leaves and an unblemished apple in good condition. And you can put it in the post, send it to to Brogdale, which is the main tree kind of HQ in a fruit tree HQ in England, and they will identify it for you. But it costs about £20 a pop to do that. So if you can find someone local to identify it for you, then that's even better.
And then grafting, you did mention grafting, somebody asked about that. Can you repeat what you said about taking the grafts?
In the cuttings, so you'd be taking the cuttings at any time between now and early spring, so in the dormant period. Take some cuttings from the very tips of the branches. It needs to be this year's growth. So have a look at the branch, follow it from the tip back, and you'll see where this year's growth is. There's usually a little collar on the branch where you can see this year's growth. But it's this year's growth you want. About pencil size thickness is the best, maybe about 6 inches long. Take a few, wrap them up in wet tissue, stick them in the fridge, and then they'll be ready for you to graft onto a rootstock in spring 2021. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah. I'm impressed that they last that long.
Yeah, as long as they're moist and in the fridge, they'll be fine.
Mm.
You can graft at different times of year, and there's bud grafting, and there's a whole world of grafting there, which I'm still learning about.
Right.
Are there any studies or examples that exist regarding the creation of habitat corridors using hedges and their impact on biodiversity on a local level? There probably are. I think the whole kind of landscape scale conservation thing is still very much in its infancy. And there's no doubt that by connecting habitats, through hedgerows, is going to increase the capacity for certain species to be able to move from one place to another. It makes sense. But in a country like ours, where there's so much pressure on the land, it's really difficult to provide a kind of unbroken connectivity route across an area, because you're either crossing a road or an arable field or a busy playground or a housing estate or a supermarket. So I think it is difficult, but I can't refer you to the specific work of research behind it, but it's definitely something we need to be learning more about what is effective and what works the best in terms of connecting different habitats together.
Brian's asking about flowers along the hedgerows, and I mean, top of my head, red campion, cow parsley, hedge mustard. There's a huge number of plants. I was trying to think. Stitchworts, of course. You see, so you have the white, the pinks, and the blue. Bluebell, stitchwort, and red campion. Those three are lovely hedgerow plants. And hedge mustard, garlic mustard. Anything else you want to add, Ewan?
No, that's good. I'm just looking at some of the other questions.
Yeah, so yeah, stitchwort and bluebells. I think those are all good ones. Okay, so Brian has been efficient, so they're still taking applications for free community trees for delivery in March. Thanks, Brian, for helping.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, so I mean, one thing I would say is that I'm always surprised. You plant a hedge and it looks so titchy. And I suppose in your own garden, you're a bit more impatient. But if, say, I do it in a school, I come back 3 years later, I can't believe how big it's grown.
Mm.
It's kind of, sometimes I think we're very impatient and you think, oh, it's too slow. But they do definitely take on well. And Jerry has asked about griselinia hedges. Well, I haven't had any experience of griselinia hedges. They certainly provide good shelter where they take.
Particularly good in coastal areas, I think.
Yeah.
Griselinia, but it's a nice evergreen, fairly fast-growing hedge. I think it looks good in a garden setting. I wouldn't plant it in a if you're overlooking the countryside.
No, same.
But probably prune's better than something like laurel, which is not best. best evergreen to plant as a hedge, really.
No. And one thing maybe I haven't mentioned is privet. Once privet is allowed to flower, that's a brilliant plant for pollinators, especially moths like it. So that is a very good plant.
Right, okay.
Right, okay. So I think maybe, is that the last questions? Yep. So of course, if you want to chat to us, just email us, or, you know, if you want to get involved with anything that's inspired you, contact us. There's so much to learn about trees and tree growing, and pruning is definitely a topic that you never learn enough about, is it?
And also volunteers. If anyone wants to get involved with the Wildlife Trust and start volunteering, we're always looking for new people to get involved and help the movements move forward.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today, and hope you enjoyed it.